Hello everyone, welcome to another video. Now, I did a video a while back talking about dividing fractions and looking at some of the relationships that come about when we do this. I'm just going to do another video on the same topic, but just looking at a different way to kind of visualize this because with a lot of things in maths, there are multiple ways to get to the same answer. And I want to show you this method for dividing fractions using fraction squares. Now, I've drawn a couple in here, and we're going to go through some examples and confirm our answer using the strategy and techniques we found out in our previous video on dividing fractions. So this will just be using our old method just to confirm the answers we get when we divide these fractions using fraction squares. Now, I have included three questions here. Let's have a look at the first one. So I have a half divided by a quarter. Now, think back to when you first learnt about division in primary school. So you would always get described division as how many times does this number, the number you're dividing by, go into this number here. So in essence, what we're asking is by saying a half divided by a quarter, we're just asking how many times does a quarter go into a half? Now, even though these are fractions, we can still work through this the same way. Now, I've got two fraction squares here, and one of those is showing a half, and the other is showing a quarter. Now, let me just draw this in quickly. I have my half, and I have my quarter. So I want to see how many times my quarter goes into my half. Now, with fractions, we talked about this a little bit when we thought about adding and subtracting fractions. Because we have a different denominator here, these fractions are kind of speaking a different language here. So we want to get them to the same denominator so we can kind of figure out how these interact and how they sit together. So I'm going to break this half into quarters. And now I've set up, I still have the exact same fraction, but I have just made an equivalent fraction here. So 2/4. And I have my quarter down here. Now, just by looking, if I were to cut and paste this particular, whoops, if I were to cut and paste this particular fraction into my top fraction square, it would fit into it 1 and 2 times. So we can say that dividing a half by a quarter, or finding how many times does a half go into a quarter, it goes through it 2 times. So a half divided by a quarter gives us 2. Now, just to confirm this using the method we came up with in the last video, if you haven't seen that, you can check that out in the playlist. So a half divided by a quarter. Another quick numerical way we could do this was, if you remember, we can change our sign to a multiplication and we can find the reciprocal of this thing here. So we flip it and this becomes a multiplication. So this we can rewrite as a half times 4/1, and then that gives us 4/2, and that gives us 2. So we get the exact same thing. Now, like I said, these fraction squares are just a cool way for us to visualize how many times a fraction goes into another one, or how we can divide these. Now, let's look at another example here. Now, I've used sort of different denominators here, or denominators that we can't make into one another as easy as we did in the previous example. So I'm looking at a half divided by a third, or how many times does a third go into a half? Now, once again, you can see that I have my half here and my third here. But now, once again, my fractions, a half and a third, they're speaking a different language here. We want to get the denominator to be the same. Now, the lowest common denominator, so the lowest number that both 2 and 3 goes into, is 6. So we can split these up into 6 portions. Now, let me draw that in. So my one down the bottom, I can split this up into 6 bits here. And this one here, I can do the same to. Now you can see these two look a lot more similar. They're speaking the same language, right? So we want to see now, well, how many times does this thing in the bottom go into this thing on the top? Now, we can clearly see it goes into it once, because we can just see it matched up from top and bottom. And we can also see that, well, another portion of this one fits in perfectly into here. So we can say that a third goes into a half 1.5 times. Can we sort of see that? It goes one whole time, it goes one, and it goes another half times as well. Half of this one on the bottom fits in perfectly here. So it goes into, a third goes into a half 1.5 times. Now we have this written as a mixed numeral. We can also write it as an improper fraction, 3 halves. Now, this is kind of interesting because let's look at the portions we've got here. In our top one, we have 3 out of 2. So that's kind of interesting, right? When we look at how many times the bottom goes into the top, by looking at these portions and sort of cutting and pasting them in, well, we can see that the fraction we make is 3 over 2. Now, let's do this the other way we learned in the previous video, just to double check. And now, like I said, there's multiple ways we can get to the same answer. That's the great thing with maths. You can pick the way that you like best. Now, a half dividing by a third is the same as multiplying by the reciprocal. So it's the same as flipping this fraction and then changing the division sign to a multiplication. Now, when we do this, we get 3 over 2, 3 halves. Because our numerators multiply, 3 times 1 gives us 1, and our denominators multiply, 2 times 1 gives us 2. Now, in all of these questions, well, these previous two, we've been looking at the fraction down the bottom, the one we're dividing by, is smaller than the one on the top. Now, let's actually see what happens when the fraction on the bottom is actually bigger than the one on the top. And this example here should illustrate that now. So we have a quarter divided by 2/3. Now, on the top, let me draw in my quarter. On the bottom, let me draw in my 2/3. Okay, cool. Once again, we're not speaking the same language here. Our fractions are expressed with different denominators. We want to get these two fractions to the same denominator so they can kind of speak the same language. They can communicate a bit better. We can understand how they relate. So 4 and 3, the smallest number that both of these go into is 12. And sorry, I should have actually been writing these. So lowest common denominator equals 12. Now, I want to break up both of these fractions into 12. Now, this may look a little messy because I don't have a load of space, but just bear with me. Hopefully it'll look relatively neat. Now, here I can break this up into 12. Whoops. To here, to here. And I'm going to keep doing this until I have 12 equal bits. Now, this fraction, a quarter, becomes 3 over 12. That's the equivalent fraction here. Let me write that quickly. 3/12. Oh, let me write it like this, actually. 1/4, I can write as 3/12. And I've just shown that here in this image. Now, breaking this one up now as well, I can get my 12 equal bits and express this as a fraction with a denominator of 12. So I can rewrite this, right? So 2/3 I can rewrite as 8/12. Sorry, it's hard to see that here, but this was meant to be in here as well. Perfect. So I have my 8/12 now. So we want to see, well, how many times does the bottom, my 8/12, go into, sorry guys, my app's glitching out a little bit. We want to find how many times each of these, well, my 2/3 or my 8/12 goes into a quarter or 3/12. Now you can see which portion of my 8 shaded bits here goes into the thing on the top. Now, you should be able to see, I know there's a lot of lines, it's a bit hard, but we can see only this many go into my top fraction square here. So what portion of my 8/12 or my 2/3 are going into my quarter? Well, I have 3 that I've shaded in out of 8. So my answer is going to be 3/8. When I divide a quarter by 2/3, I get an answer of 3/8. Or I get that 2/3 goes into a quarter, not the full 8 times, because this bottom one is a bit bigger. The portion is bigger than my top one. So it goes into it a fraction of that. And that fraction is 3/8. Now, very last step, I'm just going to show this in the way we talked about in the previous video. So a quarter divided by 2/3, that's the same as a quarter times by 3/2. So I've done the same thing. I've changed my division to a multiplication and I've found the reciprocal of 2/3, or my flipped number of 2/3. Now, when I get this, once again, to multiply fractions, I multiply the numerators. 1 times 3, that gives me 3. And I multiply my denominators. 4 times 2 gives me 8. So once again, I've shown, that a quarter divided by 2/3 gives me 3/8. And this is a cool, hopefully intuitive way for you to visualize how we're actually dividing these. And this takes the idea that, the same idea that we would have been talking about maybe when you were in primary school, where the first time you did division, you were looking at how many times does this number go into this number. That's what we're trying to show here using our fraction squares. Thanks so much for joining me, guys. I'll see you next time.